Beneath the scorching sun, 8 bodies hung upside down. Their hands and feet were bound tight, their ankles tied to coarse ropes. Their bodies dangled there, trembling clear as throat with every broken breath. Their hair hung down, caked with dust and sweat. Blood rushed to their heads, turning their faces a deep red, while veins stood out beneath their sun-browned skin. The crowd stood in a circle around them. No one stepped in. There were only cold stares and dry, emotionless murmurs. And then, the sound of horse hooves rang out. Slow, heavy, steady. That sound sliced through the thick, suffocating air. From the far end of the dusty road a rider appeared, Caleb Rowan. He rode into the middle of town, not fast, not slow. He just moved straight toward the tree. The horse came to a stop. Caleb lifted his head and looked up. In that moment, one of the 8 moved faintly. She struggled to raise her head, even as blood pounded downward in waves of sharp pain. Her vision blurred, but she forced her eyes open. She saw Caleb. Her dry, cracked lips parted, and she whispered in broken breaths, "Do not let me die here." No one in the crowd reacted, but someone stepped forward. From the wooden porch across the street, 2 men in dust-covered coats, their hands resting loosely on their gun grips, rode forward at a slow pace. Their eyes were not filled with anger, but cold like men who knew they stood on the side of power. One of them stopped in front of Caleb Rowan's horse. "This is town business," he said, his voice dry as sand. "Stay out of it." The other smirked, his voice low and edged. "Law of Sheriff Victor Hale." That name dropped into the air like a stone. No one said another word, just silence. Caleb sat still in the saddle, his gaze moving slowly across the 8 trembling bodies, across the motionless crowd. He had seen scenes like this in other towns, places where people learned to look away just to survive. The hot wind blew through, carrying dust and a faint groan from the tree. The man stepped closer. "You should not get involved in this," he growled. "Right on before Sheriff Victor Hale finds out." Everyone understood. Victor Hale was not just a sheriff. He was the water. He was the law. He was the fear that all of Red Hollow swallowed down every single day. Caleb remained silent. He lifted his head and looked up again. His eyes met Nayeli's. Her eyes had dimmed, but they had not gone out. No more pleading, only waiting. Caleb let out a slow breath. He stepped down from the horse. The sound of his boots hitting the dust landed sharp and dry. The man frowned. "What the hell are you?" Caleb did not look at him. He walked straight toward the tree. Each step was clear, not fast, not slow, just unstoppable. His hand moved to the knife at his side. He pulled it free. The steel flashed in the sunlight, and just before anyone could react, Caleb Rowan raised the blade to the rope. "Thank you for spending your valuable time with me. If you want to keep riding through dusty afternoons like this, you can subscribe to the channel." The rope snapped. A body dropped. Caleb Rowan caught her. He did not let her head hit the ground. He did not let the dust swallow someone who had just been pulled back from the line between life and death. Everything happened fast, clean and cold, just like the way he lived. No explanation, no glance back at the crowd, just action. Each rope was cut. Each body was lowered. Some of the girls passed out the moment they touched the ground. Others convulsed, coughing, struggling to breathe again like people dragged up from deep water. The crowd did not move closer, but they did not leave either. They stood there, watching, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Caleb gave them no answer. He lifted each of them onto the wagon, then turned away. No one stopped him. No one dared. Only their eyes followed him, heavy as stone. Caleb's ranch lay nearly half a day's ride from Red Hollow, a place with no tall trees, no sign of people, only wind, cracked earth, and old wooden pens. He brought them inside. Water was poured out, small sips at a time. No rush. He did not let them choke. Cloth strips were torn from old shirts. The cuts and bruises along their ankles and wrists were cleaned. Caleb did everything, as if he had done this many times before, but he did not ask not a single question. Night fell, and the cold crept into their skin. A small fire burned in the stove. The 8 girls lay around it, completely silent. Nayeli sat up, her voice still hoarse. "We are not thieves. Our parents died and left us the only thing they had. There are 8 of us, sisters, and we know the true water source of this land." Caleb just looked at her. No clear throat, no interruption. "They hung us to force it out of us," she added. Caleb set the cup of water down. "Get some sleep. Then he stood and walked into the darkness. For the first time in many days, they did not feel like they were waiting to die. Dawn spilled over Caleb's ranch like a sharpened blade. A wooden door creaked open. Nayeli stepped outside, followed by the other 7. Their steps were still weak, but no longer trembling like the night before. They did not say much. They just looked at the ground, at the wind, at the sunlight slowly rising. Caleb stood a few steps away, leaning against a wooden post, his arms crossed. He watched them, without interfering, without asking. Delilah knelt down, placing her hand on the ground. She closed her eyes. Silence. Not the kind of empty silence, but the kind that listens. A light breeze moved through the dry grass. A long moment passed. Delilah opened her eyes. "There is water here," she said. Caleb raised an eyebrow slightly. He looked down at the ground in front of him, just dry earth, cracked like everywhere else. Nayeli stepped forward. She did not argue. She did not explain. She simply placed her hand on the ground, exactly where Isla had touched. "Not deep," she said softly. Caleb stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he turned away. A moment later, he came back with a shovel. No questions. He just started digging. The first strike drove into the ground, hard, dry. The second strike, dust rose into the air. Sweat began to soak through Caleb's shirt. The girls did not just stand there. They joined in one by one. No one spoke, only the steady, patient sound of metal hitting earth. Time passed slowly. The sun climbed higher. The heat returned. One more strike, and then the sound changed. No longer dry, a soft, dull thud. Caleb stopped. He knelt down, brushing the soil aside with his hands. A layer of damp earth appeared. He dug deeper, and then water seeped through. Not strong, but real. A small stream pushed through the soil, glistening under the sunlight. Caleb sank down, his hands covered in wet mud. He looked at the thin stream of water, then at Nayeli. In that moment he understood. Maybe he had not saved them. Maybe they were the ones who had brought life back to this dead land. The news spread fast. In a land that was drying out, a ranch had started to produce water. That was not something you could hide. And then, dust appeared on the horizon. Not one rider, but many. Caleb Rowan stood in front of the wooden fence, his hand resting loosely near his gun belt, his eyes lowered slightly, tracking the cloud of dust moving closer. The horses came to a stop, not in a hurry, as if they already knew this place had nowhere to run. At the front was a man in a long black coat, his hat pulled low over half his face, Sheriff Victor Hale. He did not dismount right away. He just sat there, watching, looking at the newly repaired fence, looking at the horses lowering their heads to drink, and finally looking at Caleb. A faint smile touched his lips. Hale stepped down from his horse. He walked through the gate slowly, as if this place had always belonged to him. "Dead land that gives birth to water," he said, his voice low and drawn out. "Now that is interesting." Caleb did not respond. The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of damp earth, the kind of scent Red Hollow had not known for a very long time. Hale's gaze shifted past Caleb. The 8 girls stood there. They did not hide. They did not step back. They just stood their ground. Hale tilted his head slightly. "So, that is it." One of his men stepped forward and spat on the ground. "Them," he muttered. Hale raised a hand, signaling him to be quiet. Then he looked back at Caleb. "You know what I want," he said. No explanation, no circling around it. Caleb did not move. "No," he said. Just one word. In that moment, the air changed. Hale did not shout. He simply nodded, as if he had expected the answer. Then he turned away, took a few steps, and looked around the ranch. "Tear it down," he said. The order was released as lightly as the wind, but it landed heavy as stone. Immediately one man raised his gun and fired into a water barrel. Wood exploded. Water spilled into the dirt. Another man kicked down part of the fence. The horses panicked, jerking back. A gunshot rang out again, this time just to intimidate. No need to kill, just to show power. Caleb did not draw his gun, but his hand tightened. Behind him, Nayeli stepped forward. Her eyes were no longer weak like the day she was hanging. Sharp, steady. Hale turned back and looked straight at her. A brief moment, then he smiled. "We will be back," he said. His voice was calm but final, like a sentence. He climbed onto his horse. The others followed. Dust rose again, and when they were gone, The silence felt heavier than before. The water still flowed, but now it was no longer hope. It was something people were willing to kill for. Evening came slowly, but it did not bring peace. The sky turned a deep red, as if the land itself was bleeding. Caleb Rowan's ranch had not yet recovered from the destruction that morning. Broken planks still lay scattered. Puddles of water had spread and soaked into the ground, leaving damp marks like wounds that had not dried. No one spoke. The 8 girls stood close together. Caleb stood in front, and then the dust rose again. This time, faster, thicker. You did not need to look closely to know they were back. Sheriff Victor Hale. No more slow approach. He rode straight into the yard, leading a line of guns already prepared. The horses stopped hard. Dust filled the air. "I told you," Hale said, his voice cold as steel. "I would be back." No one answered. Hale did not wait. He raised his hand. This time, no warning. One of his men immediately raised his gun and fired into the ground right in front of Caleb's feet. Dirt burst upward. The horses behind jerked and neighed. Caleb did not step back. He just stood there, his eyes locked onto Hale. No challenge, no fear, just no surrender. Hale tilted his head, as if weighing prey. Then he slowly drew his gun. No rush, no hesitation. The barrel lifted, aimed straight at Caleb's chest. The air tightened. Behind him, a few of the girls held their breath. One of them gripped Nayeli's hand. Nayeli stepped forward. "Stop," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear. Hale did not look at her. He simply said, "Too late." His finger tightened on the trigger. Bang. The gunshot Clear's throat cracked through the air. But Caleb did not fall. One of Hale's men collapsed behind him, an arrow buried deep in his shoulder. Horses screamed in panic. From the edge of the hillside, Apache figures emerged, silent, like ghosts from the rocks. Bows drawn, arrows ready. No command needed, no shouting, just their presence was enough to turn the tide. Hale stepped back. For the first time, his eyes changed, no longer certain, no longer in control. Another arrow struck the ground right beside his foot. A warning, clear. The tension shattered. Hale's men began to raise their guns. The Apache tightened their bows. A fragile moment between firing and not firing, between life and death. Caleb stepped forward half a step, standing between both sides. He did not look back. He did not draw his gun. He just stood there, like a line drawn in the dust. The wind moved through, carrying dust and the scent of damp earth. Everyone understood. From this moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. No one fired. No one lowered their bow. The air was tight, like a rope about to snap. Caleb Rowan stood between both sides, one with revolvers, the other with bows and arrows. His eyes never left Victor Hale. Hale was no longer smiling. He looked around, seeing arrows already aimed at him and his men. The Apache warriors stood perfectly still, no shouting, no advancing, but it was enough to make the men with guns hesitate. Hale slowly lowered his gun, not out of fear, but because he knew this time he did not control everything. "You think you have won?" His voice dropped. No one answered. Behind Caleb, the people of Red Hollow began to step out of their homes. They were no longer hiding behind curtains or watching from a distance. This time they stood together, their eyes fixed on Hale. An older man stepped forward, his voice shaking but firm. "We do not need you anymore, Hale." The words were not loud, but they carried weight. Hale clenched his jaw. His eyes swept across the faces, people who used to bow their heads before him. Now, no one bowed. He let out a cold, humorless laugh. "You will come back and beg me," he said. But this time, no one believed him. Hale turned away and climbed onto his horse. His men followed in silence. Dust rose as they rode off, but it no longer felt heavy like before. The Apache warriors lowered their bows. An elder, his eyes deep and calm, stepped forward and stood before Nayeli. He gave a small nod. No words were needed. The 7 girls looked at one another, then at Nayeli. The decision rested with the eldest. Nayeli stood still for a moment. A soft breeze moved through her hair. Her eyes lingered on the land that had come back to life, on the flowing water, and finally on Caleb Rowan. Caleb did not step closer. He did not try to hold her back. He simply stood there, silent as he had been from the beginning. Nayeli took a deep breath, then turned toward the Apache warriors. "You all go home," she said softly, but clearly, One of the girls stepped forward, her voice filled with worry. "What about you?" Nayeli shook her head. No long explanation. No need. This was her choice. The elder placed a hand briefly on Nayeli's shoulder, acknowledging her decision. Then the group turned away. One by one they disappeared into the vast land beyond. Nayeli remained in the middle of the ranch. Caleb walked toward her slowly and stopped in front of her. He did not ask why. He just looked into her eyes. Nayeli looked back at him. Her eyes were no longer the eyes of someone hanging under a burning sun. Now, they were the eyes of someone who had chosen to stay. No more words were needed. They both understood. Some people come and go, but some choose to stay. Dawn came softer than the days before. No more scorching heat from the very first light. No more feeling like the sky and earth were trying to suffocate everything. Caleb Rowan's ranch was changing day by day. The water still flowed, not strong but steady. It slipped through newly dug channels, soaking into patches of land that had once been completely dry. Small shoots of grass began to emerge, fragile but persistent. The horses lowered their heads to drink, no longer startled, no longer desperate with thirst like before. The sounds were different too. No longer that heavy silence, but the sound of water, the wind, and sometimes voices. Nayeli stepped out of the wooden house, carrying a bucket of water. Her hair was tied back neatly. The bruises around her ankles were fading, leaving behind faint marks like memories that had not fully disappeared. She walked past Caleb. He was repairing the fence. Neither of them spoke right away, but there was no distance anymore. No more caution like in the early days, just familiarity. "This land needs another water channel," Nayeli said, setting the bucket down. Caleb looked in the direction she pointed. He nodded. "Yeah." No long explanation. No need to prove anything. Trust had formed, somewhere along the way. A few days later, people from Red Hollow began to arrive. Not loudly, not in groups, just one by one. They stood at the edge of the ranch, hesitant, as if stepping into a place they once had no right to enter. One man stepped forward, the same man who had stood and watched that day. His eyes were no longer cold, only uneasy. "We need water," he said. Not a demand, not an order, just a sentence. Deeply human. Caleb did not answer right away. He looked at Nayeli. She stood still. Her eyes moved across the faces in front of her, people who had once turned their backs. A silence stretched. And then, Nayeli nodded. "Take it," she said, her voice calm. No resentment, no conditions. The man lowered his head. He said nothing more, just quietly turned away. One by one, they carried the water with them. No one fought. No one raised their voice. Only a change. Slow but real. Evening fell. Golden sunlight covered the ranch. The water reflected the light, shimmering across the brown earth. Caleb stood by the fence. Nayeli stood beside him. They both looked toward the horizon where Red Hollow still lay. Still dry, but no longer hopeless. "You could leave," Caleb said, his voice low. Nayeli did not turn. "I know." A breeze passed through carrying the scent of damp earth and something new. "But I do not want to." A simple answer. No hesitation. Caleb said nothing more. He gave a small nod. The sun slowly set. Their shadows stretched across the ground. No longer two strangers. No longer a man who saved and someone who was saved. Just two people standing in a land that had once been dead and now coming back to life. The water still flowed. A quiet sound, but enough to drown out everything that once existed here, because some lands do not die from drought, but from people turning their backs, and some lands only need one person who refuses to turn away to begin again. There are lands that are not barren because they lack water, but because people have grown used to standing by. When someone else's pain becomes something to silently watch, death is no longer an ending. It becomes a habit. Red Hollow was once like that, and Caleb Rowan had once been part of that world, a man who understood the cost of stepping forward and the cost of turning away. But it only took one moment, one faint voice on the edge of death, to force him to choose again. He did not change the whole world. Nayeli and her sisters did not erase every hatred. They only did one simple thing. They did not turn away, and sometimes the simplest thing is the hardest thing of all. Because courage is not always about standing in the middle of gunfire. It is about daring to step toward another human being when everyone else chooses to stand still. and from those unseen steps, a land can come back to life. The story you are following contains many fictional elements recreated with the aid of artificial intelligence. Please listen with your own consideration and feelings. These fictional details are not intended to change history, but to evoke the spirit of the old Wild West, where people had to live amidst harsh conditions, make difficult choices, and accept the consequences.